Alright, hey guys, so this video is going to be covering over the remainder of the muscles. So we've got 61 through 70, and then we'll be done with the muscles. So to get started here, if you remember in the last video, we went over the muscles that were, like the quadriceps muscles that were on the anterior side of the thigh there, and then we covered some of those adductor muscles, which were mostly relegated to the medial side of the thigh. This time we're looking at the posterior view of the leg. So what we got here is a view looking at the back of a leg. And so what we can see is if we look up here, we can see this giant muscle right here. And this muscle is going to be largely sort of located around the hip area. And we call this muscle gluteus maximus because it's present in the gluteal region. And because of its size, we give it the name gluteus maximus, and I'll just call it gluteus max for now. So that's our gluteus maximus. And we know that if we usually have a muscle that's referred to as major, there's a minor muscle as well. In this case, we have gluteus maximus. Well, that probably means we have a smaller version of the gluteus maximus. And in this case, if we sort of took that gluteus maximus and peeled it back, what we're looking at right here is, again, a posterior view of the thigh, but this time we've removed a lot of the muscles so we can kind of look very deep at some of these deeper structures here. And one of the muscles that we see when we pull back the glute maximus is this muscle right here that we call the gluteus medius. So this muscle right here is our gluteus medius, spelled like that. So that's our gluteus medius and our gluteus maximus. And so now we said that we had that group of muscles on the anterior side of the thigh there that we called the quadriceps muscles because there was 4 muscles, quad meaning 4, ceps meaning head. So we had 4 muscles or quadriceps, and we said that those were all of our knee extensors. Well, on the posterior side of the thigh here, we have a group of muscles which are going to function as the knee flexors. And so I'm going to quickly erase the gluteus maximus here. And so the first muscle we're going to notice here, and actually before I even point that out, I want us to notice that we have one muscle right here, and then we have what would appear to be another muscle right here. However, if you look closely, what you'll actually notice is that second muscle, this one right here, this second muscle here I just highlighted, is actually 2 muscles. So if I go ahead, you'll notice that, and again, it's a little bit easier on a model, but if you look right here, and I'll make this a little bit thinner, you'll notice there's actually one tendon here sitting on top of another tendon, and then when it runs continuous and becomes those muscle fibers, there's actually sort of a line of demarcation right here, and it's sitting on top of another set of muscle fibers, and the same is true over here. So we actually have one muscle sitting on top of another muscle, and we'll talk about what those muscles are in a second. So first, we're looking at the back of the leg. This is specifically a left leg. And so on the sort of lateralmost side, so the lateralmost side being this muscle right here, and I'll make that look a little bit more like a 1. This muscle is going to be called the biceps femoris. So biceps because it has 2 heads, so we can't really see it in this image, and then femoris because it's present on the femur. So biceps, and forgive my poor handwriting, biceps femoris. So that's muscle number 1 there. And then we have our sort of muscle number 2, which is actually 2 muscles, so muscles 2 and 3. And I'm not too sure why this line here sort of disappeared. But so we've got 2 muscles here, and we have one muscle sitting on top of another muscle. And I'm actually going to go ahead and erase the biceps femoris, and I'll just erase all of it actually because it might help us to see it better. So if we just sort of highlight the muscle on top here, we'll notice it's like this. This is the muscle that's sitting on top. And then we can kind of better see that muscle that's underneath there. And I might go ahead and maybe highlight that like in yellow or something. So this is the muscle that's underneath right here. And so we have these 2 muscles here. And by the way, these collection of 3 muscles, we give the name hamstrings. So a lot of time, a lot of times we refer to the hamstrings as just like a singular muscle, but it's actually three different muscles together. So we have the biceps femoris, and then these two muscles right here form the hamstrings. And so what's that muscle on top called? Well, the muscle sort of in blue here is going to be called we'll call it semitendinosus. And so tendinosis, if you think kind of like a biceps tendon, it's sort of this more thin structure, kind of like so, and then the muscle belly would be kind of like that. And so semitendinosus sort of tells us it's kind of got a tendony shape to it. And also, if we look here, we can see that most of it is tendon. I mean, the muscle fiber itself really only runs from about there to there. So most of this muscle belly is actually made up of tendon. And I don't know off the top of my head if that's why it got its name, but just for now, that may help us remember it. And then we have another muscle underneath. And that muscle underneath, we give it the name semi. So it's another semi muscle. But this time we call it membranosus. And so how we're going to remember the semimembranosus is that if we think about what a membrane is, a membrane is usually sometimes a sort of thin flat sheet that sort of sits over something. In this case, we have the semitendinosus sitting over the semimembranosus, but if we look, the semitendinosus is this sort of long, thin, tendon-like muscle, and then if we look at the semimembranosus, it is this sort of flat, thinner sheet of muscle that sits up underneath the semitendinosus. So when we're trying to identify these sort of long muscle that is more superficial, long and thin muscle that's more superficial, is going to be our semitendinosus, and the sort of thin, more flat and broad muscle that's going to sit underneath, it's more deep, is going to be our semimembranosus. And then over here, we have our biceps femoris, which is the other muscle that forms the hamstrings. And the hamstrings collectively are going to be our knee flexors. So biceps femoris, which is the lateralmost muscle. The medial muscles of the hamstrings are the semitendinosus and semimembranosus. Semitendinosus sits on top of the semimembranosus. All right, so that's really it for the remainder of the muscles of the hip and the thigh. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of shift our attention over here to the lower leg. And so we're looking at an anterior view of the lower leg right now. Right here we can see there's we can see this tibia right here. So this is their tibia. All right. And so if that's the tibia right there, and we're looking at the anterior side of the leg, what we'll notice is we have this nice muscle right here, and we give this muscle the name tibialis anterior. It's on the anterior side of the leg, and it sits on the tibia, so it gets the name tibialis anterior. And then we have another muscle right next to it, and I'll go ahead and highlight this one in blue. And this muscle is going to be right about here, starts there, and then it's going to come down this way and go to the digits there. So this muscle is going to be given the name extensor digitorum. So this is the extensor digitorum muscle, and I know that we had an extensor digitorum in our forearm, but we also have one in our lower leg as well. So the muscle in green there is our tibialis anterior, which makes sense because it's on the anterior side of the leg and it sits on top of the tibia. And then the muscle to the right of it is going to be our extensor digitorum, which again also makes sense because if we look at those tendons there, they're going to run towards the digits or the toes there. And so that's our extensor digitorum and our tibialis anterior. And then we have another muscle, which we'll get a better view of it in a little bit, but just to kind of point it out right now, we've got this muscle right here. And this muscle right here has a name that we will call, fibularis longus. So this is our fibularis longus muscle. And I'll point this muscle out in a little bit of a better image. You can see it better when you're looking more laterally at the leg, but that is our fibularis longus muscle. And one thing to note, there's a nice little mnemonic people like to use to remember this that I've heard students use in the past. And that mnemonic is TDF. And some people like to call this sorry, bear with me here. So people like to call this Tom, Doug, and Frank. And I mean, you can choose whichever mnemonic you want to use, but Tom, Doug, and Frank. So obviously our tibialis anterior here is Tom, our extensor digitorum longus. And I think I forgot to mention that part earlier, so forgive me if I did, but this is our extensor digitorum longus. And so don't make the same mistake I just did and forget to include the longus in the name. And so extensor digitorum longus is Doug, and then our fibularis longus is Frank. So Tom, Doug, and Frank. And that's a nice little mnemonic there for us to help us remember the order that they go in. But like I said, we'll see a better image of the fibularis longus in a second. So now if we shift our view to the posterior side of the lower leg, we've got this nice big muscle here that we can see. And this muscle, in fact, actually we'll go ahead and highlight the whole thing here. So, and I'll make this a little bit thicker. So this right here is often what we'll hear referred to as our Achilles tendon. That's what this giant structure right here is. And the muscle that is going to, whose tendon is going to form the Achilles tendon, is given the name the gastrocnemius. And you'll kind of see here, it looks like two little muscles, but we're just going to go ahead and call it one big muscle. So we give this muscle the name gastroc, with a G, gastrocnemius. So the gastrocnemius is going to be that big sort of primary muscle in the back of the lower leg there, and obviously its tendon is what we often sort of colloquially call the Achilles tendon. And so what we'll also notice is if we sort of reflect back one of those heads of the gastrocnemius, we'll have this nice little muscle here sitting up underneath the gastrocnemius. And this muscle is given the name soleus. So we have the gastrocnemius on top, or superficial, and then deep to the gastrocnemius is the soleus. And if we actually look here, yes, so this is going to be a sort of lateral view of the leg here. And actually, we'll come back to this here in a second. This is the one that I want to highlight here in a second. So what we see here is, again, here's our sort of Achilles tendon here. There's our Achilles tendon, and there's sort of those heads of the gastroc there. Well, what we see sitting up underneath that Achilles tendon is this muscle right here. I'll go ahead and maybe highlight some of those fibers. So that muscle right there in green, that's sitting up underneath the gastrocnemius, is our soleus, and then that muscle there highlighted in blue is, again, our gastrocnemius. Do not worry about this muscle here highlighted in black. That is not a muscle we are going to concern ourselves with, and so I don't want you to confuse that muscle there in black for the soleus. So just recognize that that muscle there in black is not the soleus. The muscle that forms the soleus is going to be the one that's directly deep to the gastrocnemius. And so now let's come to this other model here that we skipped earlier. So this model here is nice because we can really see the fibularis longus here. So if we look here, this right here was our extensor digitorum longus muscle. I'm kind of poorly highlighting it, but this is our extensor digitorum longus muscle right here. Okay. And so there we go, there's our extensor digitorum. Again, I poorly highlighted it, but you get the idea. And then right next to it, on the sort of lateral side of the leg, is this nice long muscle right here, which we are going to give the name fibularis longus. So this muscle right here is our fibularis longus, and this is Frank in our Tom, Doug, and Frank mnemonic there. And then the blue one would be Doug there. Or our our extensor digitorum longus. So that is the fibularis longus right there, and we can see it sort of in a better view. And then posterior to that, we can see here, we can see our soleus right here sitting up underneath the gastrocnemius there. So there's our soleus right there. And then if I highlight this in sort of purple right here, we can see the gastrocnemius right there. So yeah, so gastrocnemius and soleus on the anterior side, and then sort of on the lateral side there, we have our fibularis, in green we have our fibularis longus, and then in blue there, we have our extensor digitorum longus, and then sort of on the anterior most side would be our tibialis anterior, and we can remember the tibialis anterior, the extensor digitorum longus, and fibularis longus through our mnemonic here, Tom, Doug, and Frank. And then we have our posterior muscles. We've got our what we would colloquially call the calf. We have the gastrocnemius, which is the most superficial, soleus, which is most deep, and then again those would form our calf muscles there. And so that's going to be it for the remainder of the muscles. We have now gone through all 70 muscles. This is the final video I'll be getting to you guys, and so good luck studying, and I hope you enjoyed these videos.